When Elizabeth returned from Bisley in 1544, her dresser's hands wouldn't stop shaking. The clothes made for the princess weeks earlier didn't fit anymore. Not a little tight. Completely wrong. Shoulders too broad, hips too narrow, chest too flat. Within 48 hours, every piece of her clothing was burned. By the end of this video, you'll understand why those measurements terrified them, enough to seal her body in a coffin that's never been opened in 400 years. Picture this. A young girl leaves for the countryside in pristine health, her wardrobe carefully packed by servants who've measured every inch of her growing body. 3 months later, she returns, and the woman who's dressed her since infancy can barely hold the needle steady. The sleeves won't close around the upper arms. The bodice gapes strangely at the chest, but strains across the ribcage. The shoulders split the seams when she tries to raise her arms. This wasn't normal growth. This wasn't even possible growth. When Princess Elizabeth returned from Bisley in the autumn of 1544, her personal dresser, Catherine Ashmore, discovered something that would haunt her for the rest of her short life. The child's body had fundamentally changed in ways that defied every law of nature she understood. A 10-year-old girl doesn't grow broader shoulders and narrower hips in 3 months. A child doesn't lose feminine curves that were beginning to develop and gain masculine proportions instead. Yet that's exactly what Catherine's trained hands discovered when she tried to dress the princess that first morning back at court. The panic started immediately, rippling through the household staff like a contagion. Catherine sent urgent messages to the head of the household, who arrived within the hour to see the problem himself. There stood Princess Elizabeth in her undergarments, surrounded by dresses that had been perfect when she left, now hanging wrong on her frame in ways that made no sense. The shoulder seams cut into flesh where there had been room before. The waist that had needed taking in now needed letting out, but in all the wrong places. Most disturbing was the chest area, where the carefully structured bodices designed for a developing young lady now lay flat and awkward, requiring stuffing and adjustment that hadn't been necessary 3 months prior. Court records, fragmented and suspiciously incomplete, mention an emergency requisition for new fabric and the immediate hiring of 3 additional seamstresses. What they don't mention is why. What they don't explain is how a child's measurements could change so drastically in such a short time that her entire wardrobe became unwearable. The official explanation, whispered among confused servants, was that the country air had agreed with her health so well that she'd grown rapidly. But seamstresses know bodies. They know growth patterns. And what they were seeing wasn't growth, it was transformation. Catherine Ashmore had dressed royal children for 15 years. She'd seen boys grow into men and girls into women. She knew exactly how young bodies changed and developed. The natural progression of shoulders widening, hips expanding, chests developing. What she was measuring now on Princess Elizabeth followed none of those patterns. It followed a completely different blueprint, one that would have been perfectly natural for a 10-year-old boy going through normal childhood development. Broader across the shoulders, narrower through the hips, longer in the torso, flat in the chest. Every measurement she took that morning pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Within a week, Catherine would be gone from court, retired to a distant estate with a generous pension, and instructions never to return. But before she left, she confided in her sister, a conversation that would be recorded years later in a diary discovered in an attic. She wrote that the child who returned was not the child who left, and that God helped them all for what they'd done. What had they done? And more importantly, what were they about to do to cover it up? The human body tells stories that clothes can only hide for so long. In the 16th century, garments weren't mass-produced approximations. They were architectural achievements, custom-built to specific measurements with precision that would impress modern tailors. A noble child's dress required weeks of work and multiple fittings to achieve perfect proportions. The sleeves alone involved complex patterns calculated to the quarter inch, designed to allow movement while maintaining elegant lines. The bodice was structured with whalebone and steel to create and enhance the natural shape underneath. When Princess Elizabeth's dresses stopped fitting after Bisley, it wasn't a matter of simple alterations. The very structure of the garments was wrong for the body they were trying to cover. The shoulder width was off by nearly 2 inches, a massive discrepancy that would require completely reconstructing the upper portion of every dress. The hip measurements had narrowed when they should have been gradually widening as she approached adolescence. Most telling was the torso length, now disproportionately long for what should have been a girl's developing frame. Master tailor John Malte received the commission to create Princess Elizabeth's new wardrobe, a project that should have been straightforward but instead consumed him with confusion and concern. His detailed accounts, preserved in the royal household archives, show something extraordinary. He recorded measurements that didn't match any previous records for the princess. More disturbing, his notes include marginal comments that were later scratched out but remain partially legible under modern imaging technology. One notation reads, "Proportions more suited to," with the rest violently obliterated. Another says, "Unusually broad for a maid of," again, destroyed. Malta was clearly struggling with what he was observing, trying to reconcile the measurements in front of him with what he expected from a 10-year-old princess. His solution was innovative and would set the pattern for Elizabeth's clothing for the rest of her life. He created heavily structured garments with padding in strategic locations, building an artificial feminine silhouette over a body that refused to provide one naturally. The shoulders were minimized with careful seaming and elaborate sleeve designs that drew the eye elsewhere. The hips were enhanced with early versions of the farthingale, creating width where none existed. The chest was given shape through increasingly complex bodice construction that created the illusion of curves through architecture rather than anatomy. But here's what makes John Maltese work truly significant. He kept two sets of records. The official measurements submitted to the household accounts showed numbers that made sense for a growing princess, following predictable patterns of feminine development. But in his private workshop books discovered during renovations in 1823 and subsequently seized by royal officials, he kept the real measurements. Those numbers told a completely different story. They showed a child whose body was developing along distinctly masculine lines with broad shoulders, narrow hips, long limbs, and a flat chest that resisted all attempts at natural enhancement. Malta noted in those private records that he'd been visited 3 times by members of the Privy Council and warned that any discussion of the princess's unusual proportions would be considered treason. He was paid extraordinarily well for his discretion, receiving triple the normal rate for royal commissions. He was also closely watched. Every apprentice who worked on Elizabeth's garments was carefully selected and later tracked. Several disappeared from historical records entirely after completing their work. John Malta himself died in 1547 at the age of 42, officially from plague, though no other cases were reported in his neighborhood that year. His workshop burned the same night he died, destroying decades of patterns, notes, and the physical evidence of exactly what kind of body he'd been clothing. Convenient? Absolutely. Coincidental? That's becoming harder to believe. What happened next was unprecedented in royal history and should have raised alarm bells across every court in Europe. Within 48 hours of Elizabeth's return from Bisley, an order came down from the highest levels of the royal household. Destroy everything. Not just the clothes that didn't fit. Everything. Every dress, every undergarment, every shoe and stocking and glove that had been made for Princess Elizabeth before her departure was to be collected and burned. No exceptions, no preservation, no donations to lesser nobles or servants as was customary. Everything had to vanish completely. The official reasoning provided to the household staff was contamination, a vague concern about plague exposure during her time in the countryside. But this excuse fell apart under the slightest scrutiny. If plague contamination was the concern, why weren't the servants who accompanied her to Bisley quarantined? Why wasn't the princess herself isolated? Why were new clothes being made immediately with measurements taken from her supposedly contaminated body? The plague explanation was clearly nonsense, a cover story so thin it insulted the intelligence of everyone who heard it. The destruction was carried out with disturbing efficiency and secrecy. 3 large bonfires were lit in the palace courtyards at midnight, unusual timing that guaranteed minimal witnesses. Trunks of clothing were carried out by guards, not servants. Another break from protocol that raised eyebrows. The fabrics were valuable, some pieces embroidered with gold thread and sewn with precious jewels that should have been removed and saved before burning. Instead, everything went into the flames intact. Thousands of pounds worth of royal garments reduced to ash in a single night. Several servants later reported that they'd been ordered to their quarters during the burning and told that anyone caught watching from windows would be dismissed immediately. The household steward, normally meticulous in his record-keeping, made only a single brief entry about the incident. Disposed of the princess's wardrobe per council orders. No explanation, no details, no inventory of what was destroyed. For a household that documented every candle and bedsheet, this silence was deafening. Something about those clothes was dangerous enough that they couldn't be allowed to exist, couldn't be examined, couldn't be compared to the new garments being made for a body that had somehow transformed over the summer. The few people who questioned this destruction learned quickly to stop asking. A laundress who commented that it seemed wasteful to burn such fine fabrics was dismissed the next day and escorted from the palace by guards. A junior steward who noted inconsistencies in the household accounts regarding the incident was transferred to a remote manor in Scotland, effectively ending his court career. Most chillingly, Catherine Ashmore's assistant, a young woman named Margaret Poole who had helped dress the princess before Bisley, and witnessed the ill-fitting clothes after her return, died 3 months later. The official cause was listed as falling downstairs and breaking her neck, a common enough accident in the era's poorly lit palaces. But Margaret's sister insisted to anyone who would listen that Margaret had been terrified in her final weeks, claiming she'd seen something she shouldn't have, something involving the princess's body that could get them all killed. She tried to leave court service, but her resignation was denied. 2 weeks after that denial, she was dead. The message was clear: what happened at Bisley stayed at Bisley, and the clothes that didn't fit would never be available to prove anything. The wardrobe was gone, but the questions were just beginning. The servants present during Elizabeth's return from Bisley knew too much, and the royal establishment knew they knew it. These weren't casual observers, but trained professionals who had intimate knowledge of the princess's body. People who had dressed her, bathed her, measured her for clothes, and tended to her daily needs. They could testify to exactly what she looked like before Bisley, and how drastically different she appeared afterward. In any normal circumstance, these trusted servants would have continued in their positions, perhaps even been rewarded for their loyal service during a difficult period. Instead, they vanished from court with suspicious speed and disturbing finality. Catherine Ashmore, the personal dresser who'd first noticed the clothing problem, was retired with a generous pension within a week. She was only 38 years old in perfect health, at the peak of her professional career. Retirement made no sense except as a way to remove her from court and silence her observations. She was sent to a manor house in Cornwall, about as far from London as one could get while remaining in England, with explicit instructions never to return or speak about her time serving the princess. The pattern repeated with frightening consistency. Margaret Poole, Catherine's assistant, dead within 3 months of the return. 2 seamstresses who took the new measurements, Mary Clerk and Anne Taverner, were separated and sent to different estates at opposite ends of the kingdom. Both received generous financial settlements that were contingent on one specific condition, documented in their contracts. They were never to discuss the princess's measurements, clothing, or physical appearance with anyone, under penalty of treason. That final word, treason, appears repeatedly in the documents surrounding these arrangements. Not breach of contract, not violation of confidence, but treason, a charge that carried the death penalty. The royal household was making absolutely certain that these women understood the stakes. Whatever they'd seen when they measured Princess Elizabeth after her return from Bisley was dangerous enough that speaking about it would be considered an act of betrayal against the crown itself. These weren't idle threats. In the 16th century, people were executed for treason regularly, often on evidence far less substantial than eyewitness testimony about royal impropriety. Then there were the deaths that couldn't be explained away as mere coincidence. Edmund Warwick, a footman who'd accompanied Elizabeth to Bisley and witnessed her daily life both before and after whatever happened there, was found dead in a ditch in November 1544. The official report stated he'd fallen from his horse while riding drunk, but multiple witnesses testified that Edmund rarely drank and was an experienced horseman. More suspicious was the fact that his horse was found grazing peacefully 100 yards away, completely uninjured, still saddled and bridled. If he'd fallen during a riding accident, the horse would have shown signs of distress or injury as well. The circumstances suggested something far more sinister than an accident. Thomas Gray, a groom who'd made an ill-advised joke at a tavern about the young lord needing new dresses, was found floating in the Thames 2 weeks later. Drowning was common enough in London, but Thomas was known as a strong swimmer who'd grown up near the river. His death was ruled accidental, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Within 6 months of Elizabeth's return from Bisley, 5 people directly connected to her household were dead, and another dozen had been removed from court and scattered across England. The systematic elimination of witnesses was as thorough as it was terrifying. The clothing crisis of 1544 forced the creation of a deception that would last 44 years, and that deception required increasingly elaborate disguises built from fabric and steel. As Elizabeth grew from child to teenager to adult, her body continued developing along masculine lines, and her clothing had to work harder to hide that reality. By the time she reached her 20s, she had pioneered fashion innovations that seemed revolutionary, but were actually desperate solutions to a biological problem. The farthingale, that cage-like structure that extended the hips to absurd widths, wasn't a fashion statement. It was architectural necessity, creating feminine curves where the body underneath offered only narrow masculine hips. The garment became more exaggerated as Elizabeth aged, eventually extending her silhouette by nearly 2 feet on each side. Foreign visitors found it ridiculous, commenting that English ladies looked like ships trying to navigate through doorways. But for Elizabeth, it was essential armor, a structure that made her actual body shape irrelevant, because no one could see it underneath the architectural monstrosity of her skirts. The bodice construction became equally extreme and equally revealing of what it was hiding. Elizabeth's corsets were legendary for their rigidity and discomfort. They were built with steel boning, not the flexible whalebone used in other women's garments, creating a cage so rigid it could stand upright without a body inside it. The front featured a wooden or metal piece called a busk that ran from just below the breast to the lower abdomen, creating an artificially flat, elongated torso. But here's what's fascinating. The structure didn't just flatten, it redistributed and created. Padding was sewn into specific areas to suggest curves that didn't exist naturally. The chest area was built up with layers of fabric and wire, creating the illusion of breasts where there was only a flat, masculine chest. The waist was cinched impossibly tight, not to achieve the fashionable tiny waist of the era, but to create contrast, to make the padded hips and chest look more pronounced by comparison. Every element of the bodice worked together to construct a feminine body from scratch, building it onto a frame that nature had designed along completely different lines. Portraits from the era show this artificial silhouette in all its glory, but they also show something else if you know what to look for. A stiffness, an unnaturalness, a body that doesn't move like a woman's body because it's not actually a woman's body at all, just an elaborate costume built to suggest one. Then there were the collars, those enormous ruffs that became Elizabeth's trademark and have puzzled fashion historians for centuries. Why would anyone voluntarily wear these monstrosities? They were uncomfortable, impractical, required constant maintenance, and made simple activities like eating nearly impossible. Some ruffs extended nearly a foot from the neck, starched and wired to maintain their shape, looking more like dinner plates than clothing. The official explanation has always been that they were simply fashionable, that Elizabeth set trends that others followed. But fashion doesn't usually choose maximum discomfort without reason. Those collars served a crucial purpose. They hid the neck and throat. The male larynx, the Adam's apple, is one of the most obvious physical markers of biological sex, and it's nearly impossible to completely disguise. A high, elaborate ruff made it impossible to see Elizabeth's throat clearly, keeping that telltale masculine feature hidden behind layers of starched linen and lace. The ruffs grew larger and more elaborate as Elizabeth aged and her Adam's apple became more prominent. By her 40s, she was wearing collars so extreme that they required wire supports and extended behind her head like halos. They weren't fashion. They were necessity, one more piece of the elaborate architectural disguise that kept the truth hidden for 4 decades. The physical evidence was always there, visible to anyone who knew what they were looking for, and foreign ambassadors definitely noticed, even if they didn't understand what they were seeing. The reports sent back to European courts are filled with confused observations about Elizabeth's physical appearance, descriptions that make perfect sense once you understand the Bisley theory. The Venetian ambassador wrote in 1558 that the new queen possessed a voice deeper and more commanding than is natural for women, and that her manner of speech has more of the soldier than the lady. He wasn't trying to insult her. He was genuinely confused by what he was observing, a person who looked like a woman but sounded and moved like a man. The Spanish envoy noted that Elizabeth's hands were unusually large and powerful for one of the gentler sex, and that she gripped his hand during their formal greeting with a strength that surprised him. These weren't casual observations. These were trained diplomats whose job was to assess foreign royalty with professional precision, and they were reporting details that didn't add up. The most damning report came from the French ambassador who had the opportunity to observe Elizabeth during an extended visit to the English court in 1564. His encrypted dispatches back to Paris are remarkable for their detail and their obvious confusion about what he was witnessing. He described Elizabeth's stride as long and confident, more like a man's gait than a lady's mincing steps. He noted that she sat with legs apart, a decidedly masculine posture that had to be corrected by her ladies on multiple occasions. Most significantly, he reported watching her hunt, an activity where her true physical nature became impossible to disguise. On horseback, Elizabeth rode as well as any man at court, sitting astride rather than side saddle. controlling powerful horses with strength that shocked male riders. She could hunt for 10 hours without showing fatigue, outlasting men half her age. Her stamina, her physical power, her comfort with masculine activities all pointed to a body that had been trained and developed as male, regardless of the clothes covering it. The French ambassador concluded his report with a cryptic statement that has puzzled historians. "There is something about Her Majesty's form that is not as other women, though I cannot speak plainly of it." What couldn't he speak plainly about? What had he observed that was too dangerous to write explicitly, even in encrypted communication? But the most revealing evidence of all comes from Elizabeth's own measurements, preserved in household records and tailor's notes across her lifetime. If you chart these measurements over time, you see something remarkable. They follow the developmental pattern of a biological male, not a female. Her shoulder width at age 25 was recorded as 16 inches, extraordinarily broad for a woman of that era when the average female shoulder width was 12 to 13 inches. Her hip measurement at the same age was 32 inches, narrow for a woman but perfectly normal for a man. The ratio of shoulder to hip width is one of the most reliable indicators of biological sex, and Elizabeth's ratio was distinctly masculine throughout her life. Even more telling, her measurements didn't change the way a woman's would as she aged. Women's hips typically widen slightly with age, even without childbearing, and their shoulders often narrow as they lose muscle mass. Elizabeth's proportions remained constant, the shoulders staying broad, the hips staying narrow, exactly as you'd expect in a biological male. The clothing had to accommodate these proportions for 44 years, growing ever more elaborate and concealing as the deception became harder to maintain. When Elizabeth fell seriously ill in 1566, so ill that everyone believed she was dying, her doctors faced an impossible situation. They needed to examine her properly to diagnose and treat the illness, but Elizabeth absolutely refused to allow a thorough physical examination. For days, she grew weaker while her physicians begged for permission to assess her condition fully. The political situation became desperate. With no clear heir, England faced potential civil war if Elizabeth died. The Privy Council gathered in emergency sessions, preparing for chaos. William Cecil, her most trusted advisor, pleaded with her to allow the examination, arguing that her life and the stability of the kingdom depended on proper medical care. Finally, after nearly a week of deterioration, Elizabeth granted permission for her personal physician, Dr. Hewick, to conduct a complete examination. What happened in that room has been the subject of speculation for over 400 years because Dr. Hewick's reaction told a story that his official reports never would. When Dr. Hewick emerged from Elizabeth's chambers after nearly 90 minutes alone with the Queen, witnesses reported that he looked like he'd seen a ghost. His face had gone completely pale, drained of color in a way that shocked the courtiers waiting outside. His hands trembled as he wrote his initial notes, and several people commented that he seemed deeply shaken, almost traumatized by whatever he'd discovered during the examination. But here's what's most significant. He prescribed treatment immediately, and Elizabeth began recovering within days. So whatever he found, he was able to address it medically. The illness wasn't the shock. Something else was. Something about Elizabeth's body that he discovered during that intimate examination left him so disturbed that he could barely function afterward. In the weeks following the examination, Dr. Hewick became a changed man. He withdrew from court social life, stopped attending gatherings with other physicians, and refused to discuss the Queen's case even in the vaguest terms with professional colleagues who wanted to learn from his successful treatment. When questioned about his reticence, he would simply say that some things were better left unspoken, that the Queen's privacy was paramount, and that he'd given an oath he intended to keep. But his behavior suggested something beyond professional discretion. It suggested fear. Within a year of that examination, Dr. Hewick was dead. The official cause was recorded as sudden fever, that convenient, vague diagnosis that explained nothing and ended all questions. He was 53 years old in apparent good health before the illness struck without warning. No other cases of this particular fever were reported at court or in London. He simply fell ill and died within days, too quickly for any meaningful treatment or intervention. His death was remarkably convenient for anyone wanting to ensure that whatever he discovered about Elizabeth's body remained secret. Even more suspicious was what happened to his medical records. Dr. Hewick was known for meticulous record-keeping, maintaining detailed notes on all his patients, especially the royal family. Those notes would have been invaluable to historians, providing insights into the medical history of Elizabeth and her court. But when his estate was settled after his death, his medical records were nowhere to be found. Every other aspect of his professional life was carefully documented and preserved, but the patient notes had vanished completely. The official explanation was that he'd destroyed them himself before his death to protect patient privacy. But this raises an obvious question. If patient privacy was his concern, why not destroy all his records? Why only the medical notes while leaving everything else intact? The clothing crisis that began in 1544 when a child returned from Bisley wearing a body that didn't match her wardrobe would continue until the very end of Elizabeth's life. As she aged, the garments became more elaborate, more concealing, more architecturally complex. By her 60s, she was wearing wigs that added nearly a foot to her height, ruffs that extended 18 inches from her neck, farthingales that made her skirts 6 feet wide, and makeup so thick it formed a mask that obscured her actual features. She was essentially wearing a full-body costume designed to hide every physical characteristic that might reveal the truth. Even in her final illness, as death approached, and court protocol would normally have required more simple, comfortable clothing, Elizabeth insisted on maintaining the elaborate disguise. She refused to be seen without her wig, without her makeup, without the structured garments that had hidden her body for 4 decades. Her ladies begged her to rest comfortably in simple nightclothes, but she rejected this absolutely, insisting on full court dress even as she could barely stand. It was as if she knew that the moment she appeared in anything less than full armor, someone might see what lay underneath and understand what those ill-fitting clothes after Bisley had first revealed. The body of a boy where a princess's body should have been. When Elizabeth finally died on March 24, 1603, her body was sealed with the kind of speed and secrecy that confirmed every suspicion about what she'd been hiding. The doors to her death chamber were locked immediately. Guards posted with orders to allow no one in or out without explicit authorization. The preparation of her body happened behind those locked doors with only a handful of witnesses, all sworn to silence under threat of treason charges. They undressed her corpse, removing layer after layer of the costume she'd worn for 44 years. First the gown, then the petticoats, then the farthingale that created false hips, then the corset that built an artificial feminine silhouette, then the padding that suggested curves where none existed. As they stripped away each layer, they were undoing decades of deception, revealing the truth that the clothes had been designed to hide. And what they found underneath, according to the few fragmentary accounts that survived, was exactly what Catherine Ashmore had discovered 59 years earlier when she tried to dress a child returned from Bisley. A body that was fundamentally wrong for the gender it had claimed to be. Within hours, Elizabeth's body was wrapped in treated cloth and placed inside a lead coffin that was soldered shut before rigor mortis had fully set. The servants who witnessed the preparation were immediately scattered across England, sent to remote estates with generous pensions and explicit threats about execution if they spoke. The doctors who had attended her final days began dying under suspicious circumstances within months. And the coffin was sealed in Westminster Abbey, where it remains to this day, protected by orders that have been maintained for over 400 years. Every other English monarch of significance has been studied, examined, even exhumed for historical research. But not Elizabeth. The establishment has denied every request to examine her remains, even with modern technology that could scan through the coffin without opening it. They claim it's about respecting the dead, but that excuse rings hollow when they've opened every other royal tomb without such concerns. What makes Elizabeth different? The answer lies in those clothes that didn't fit in 1544, in the measurements that were wrong, in the body that was sealed away so quickly that no one outside a trusted few could examine what had been hidden underneath the costume. The coffin protects the same secret the clothes were designed to hide. Elizabeth I was not what the world believed her to be, and the proof lies in a skeleton that has been kept from scientific examination for 4 centuries. Because bones don't lie about biological sex the way clothes can disguise it. If this evidence has convinced you that history has been hiding the truth about England's most famous monarch, then you need to be part of this investigation. Subscribe to this channel right now because we're uncovering secrets that the establishment has protected for centuries. And the deeper we dig, the more shocking the discoveries become. Every subscriber helps us reach more people who deserve to know what's been hidden from them and gives us the resources to continue researching the conspiracies they don't want exposed. Hit that like button if you believe it's finally time for Westminster Abbey to allow DNA testing of that sealed coffin after 400 years of silence. Your like sends a message that people are ready for the truth, no matter how world-shattering it might be. And drop your theory in the comments below because this community is brilliant at connecting dots that historians miss. Do you think the ill-fitting clothes prove the Bisley boy swap happened? Are there other physical details we should investigate? What other evidence are they hiding? Your insights could be the key that finally unlocks this centuries-old mystery. The clothes didn't fit in 1544 because a boy came back wearing a dead girl's wardrobe. The coffin stays sealed in 2025 because that boy's skeleton would prove everything. Share this video everywhere because the truth has been buried long enough.